Hare Krishna, Maharaj. Thank you again for joining us on this third topic, and very important topic as well, which is sexuality. Every human being has this aspect to their identity. So we're going to discuss the topic of sexuality in two different sessions. The first one now, which we want to hear from you, is the philosophical, theological perspectives that our tradition has on the topic of sexuality, both the Vedic perspective and the Chaitanya Vaishnava Gaudiya perspective. So if you can kind of give us a little bit your knowledge of this philosophical, theological angle to the topic of sexuality from our tradition. Yes. Later on, we'll talk about some practical aspects.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, we find in Shastra that the two most dangerous passions in human beings, dangerous in the sense that they lead people to materialism, and with materialism, there must be conflict, there must be war, there must be all kinds of evils. And human society can only really live peacefully in the mode of goodness, because the mode of passion, Krishna defines it in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18 and other places. The mode of passion is necessarily a state of conflict. And so a society which is governed by the mode of passion, or a world which is governed by it, will always be in conflict. So something's at stake here. And for example, I once did a study of the first 300 chapters of Mahabharata. And I did a specific search to see how Dharma is used. In what context, in what situations is Dharma invoked? This is the first 300 chapters of the Mahabharata. And what I found is that in every case, Dharma was invoked either in regard to violence or in regard to sexuality. And so every case, Dharma was cited or mentioned in regard to violence and sexuality, physical violence and sexuality. And why? Because these are the two heaviest passions and therefore the most dangerous to civilization. For example, rape, or people who are sexually uncontrolled commit violence, or they destabilize society in various ways. There are many different ways according to contemporary science, but so therefore, talking about sexuality now, another point that in Vedic culture, they make a clear distinction between principles that should be actually legislated. There should be laws. It should be illegal to do certain things, and principles which have to be left to culture. For example, it's not illegal to walk down the street insulting people, but it's extremely bad manners, and people that do that are basically ostracized. And so there's the question: where does Vedic culture draw the line? What should be legislated? What should be law? And what should just be culturally encouraged? For example, hunting, because. And other point I have to mention, and of course we'll get to sexuality, that if a government passes a law that people are not going to follow, that actually weakens the rule of law in general. And this discovery led by academic criminologists, led to a completely new theory of policing, which is called zero tolerance. Because what they found is that, let's say in a neighborhood, if you allow people to jaywalk, to cross against a red light, or simply to, other, minor infractions, then this creates a general atmosphere of lawlessness and leads to greater crimes and violent crimes. So that was the background of the zero tolerance theory of criminology. And that's something which is understood in Vedic culture. For example, if you tell kings not to hunt, they're going to hunt anyway, And the fact that they break the rule will weaken the rule of law in general. But what the Shastra does do, you give one story after another where great kings ruin their lives by hunting. We have the case of Dasaratha, who basically died. His life was destroyed by a hunting accident. Pandu lost his life because of a hunting accident. Parikshit lost his life because of a hunting accident. So that's the general principle of sort of like the Vedic philosophy of law. You know, where's the line between things that should be prohibited by law and things that should just be culturally discouraged? Or another thing which is heavily discouraged culturally is polygamy. The whole disaster of Ramchandra being banished was because of polygamy. Or, for example, in the case of Chitraketu, ultimately he lost his only child because of polygamy. And so there are many cases like that. Again, in polygamy, or perhaps the most obvious proof that polygamy was allowed but not encouraged is that the word for co-wife in Sanskrit, sapatni. Sa means with in Sanskrit. It's a prefix, and it's used in the sense that we say co, like a co-wife. And so sapatni means co-wife. And from that word, if you just make it masculine and say sapatna, it means enemy. So one common word, which is in the Gita, for enemy comes from the word co-wife. So again, you know, big political leaders will be promiscuous, will enjoy many women, as we find all over the world, but in other ways it's discouraged. So in the case of sexuality, of course, we also draw the line, but, you know, we should consider that Prabhupada's original idea was to create a Brahminical society. So, for example, to define illicit sex as sex outside of marriage, not for procreation, is a very high Brahminical definition. And Prabhupada many times said that illicit sex means outside of marriage. And Prabhupada even said it's foolish to think that married people will never have sex. But that's not the Brahminical standard. So I sent all the evidence to the GBC years ago, Prabhupada statements, just Prabhupada statements. And I said, why don't you tell the world this? And of course, they refused. In other words, to tell the world what Prabhupada had said. So obviously, for an advanced devotee, or a devotee who occupies a respectable position as a brahmana, then sex should be for procreation and marriage. But for people in general, and frankly, for devotees in general, because a very, very, very strong majority of devotees are not Brahmins. I mean, they may be Brahmins. We have to remember that in Vedic culture, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas also take second initiation. And so the fact that one receives Gayatri within Vedic culture doesn't mean someone is a Brahmana. And in regard to this, another important point, I think one of the biggest problems in ISKCON is the statement, which is true, but dangerous, that a Vaishnava is more than a Brahmin, is better than a Brahmin. This has led to, which is true, let's say a practicing Vaishnava, but it's led to I think a major social problem in ISKCON, and a major just problem for ISKCON. And that is because a devotee is more than a Brahmin, we don't need actual Brahmanas. It's like saying because a devotee is a car mechanic, we don't need a car mechanic. Or a devotee is more than a cook, so we don't need cooks. Or devotee is more than a kshatriya, so we don't need managers, competent managers. The fact is that ISKCON desperately needs brahmanas. And ISKCON, if you follow the money trail and let money speak, then ISKCON, spends probably for every dollar it spends on education, probably spends $1,000 on rituals. So getting back to the point of sexuality, the first thing is, I say we have to be realistic. So regarding, for example, homosexuality, the point I kept making, and I was sort of accused of being almost like evil for saying it, is that whatever your sexual orientation, monogamy is much better than promiscuity. In fact, let's say a homosexual devotee who's not encouraged to get married or to make, whatever, some kind of vow like that, is actually is much more likely may become a sexual predator or a sexual victim of seduction. And so it is obviously in the rational interest of any civilized society, including ISKCON, to strongly encourage monogamy among all people who are unavoidably sexually active. And as far as the general standard, I think, we just have to encourage people to practice bhakti yoga to the best of their ability, and then a natural hierarchy forms. The danger is not that there are people who chant Hare Krishna and are not self-controlled. The danger is that there's no hierarchy, there's no distinction. And it's not a hierarchy that sort of, discourages and bullies people who aren't so strict, but it's a hierarchy that recognizes, there are natural hierarchies, like between parents and children, between teachers and students, and Krishna himself created a natural hierarchy. The Bhagavad Gita is a balance between hierarchy and equality. Krishna strongly emphasizes equality. Pandita samadarshana samohang sarvabhuteshu samak sarveshu bhuteshu. I mean, Krishna strongly emphasizes equality and also strongly teaches hierarchy. And so respecting all Vaishnavas is not dangerous if equality is balanced with hierarchy.
Thank you. So that seems to be very both practical and philosophical. Would you like to give maybe some references to our scriptures of how we're encouraged to be, accommodating, or how we're encouraged to be very strict or not accommodating? What are the references that we could use to highlight these positions?
Well, first of all, we'd have to find the references for being very strict. And of course, and I would say a lot of the references for being strict are in relation to the more advanced members of society. And so clearly, if someone is a spiritual leader, they have to strictly follow the principles. But then again, we should be merciful. And it's understood that in Krishna conscious or Vedic culture, everyone is engaged in all classes of society. And we do not find expectations that lower class people will follow the same principles as higher class people. Because if lower class people did follow the same principles, why would you call them lower class? In other words, why would you? So there is a spiritual hierarchy, and there may be people who can't strictly follow the principles, but have real devotion and are very valuable members of the society. And they themselves should recognize their spiritual level and act in ways which are appropriate for someone at that level. It doesn't mean they should be humiliated or bullied or looked down upon or publicly shamed or criticized. In other words, everyone who is acting appropriately within their situation is respectable.
So would you say that there's some manifestations of lust, sexuality, which could be accommodated, like you were mentioning monogamy is like what an obvious way that it could be accommodated, and there are ways which you cross the red line and it becomes negative, it becomes detrimental to your spiritual life and to your health, spiritual health. So where would that line be of like the sexuality which we definitely don't recommend, or we don't see with good eyes, or we don't try to encourage?
But then again, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita about our human needs: don't eat too much or too little, don't sleep too much or too little. And so what Prabhupada always said is we should reduce as much as possible our material activities. And if their best is still to be promiscuous, then obviously that person is dangerous in a spiritual society, because that person is promiscuous and may very likely degrade other people. So I would say promiscuity, if someone is, unavoidably or unashamedly promiscuous, they sort of have to serve Krishna at a distance. They can still do service, they can still offer things, but I think they can't, they can't really intimately associate with a spiritual community because they're dangerous.
Thank you. Anything else you would like to add on this very?
No, I think those are the main points, at least that I can say.
Well, thank you very much for participating from the distance, all the way from South America. We hope that one year we'll be able to have your physical presence in one of our conferences. We have many topics that I'm sure you would be able to contribute with. So we hope to see you.
Yeah. Thank you. It'd be a pleasure and honor to be there with all of you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.